rub the suds out of your belt, and you'll forget all about sleep. Butter your eye.
Drink party, boys and girls!
Hey, is that some new stunt? Drinking the chaser first.
No, I forgot to tell Rocky. You'll have to excuse me, boys and girls, but I'm off the stuff for keeps.
Oh, what the hell was that?
That was Jason Robards and Company in the 1960 televised version of Eugene O'Neill's The Iceman Cometh. This is Theater Talk. I'm Susan Haskins, and here with me my co-host, Michael Riedel of the New York Post.
Well, there's a lot of stuff going on Broadway with Eugene O'Neill these days. There was, of course, recently the revival of The Iceman Cometh, and opening in March we have a revival of A Moon from the Misbegotten starring Cherry Jones. O'Neill is, I think, considered America's greatest playwright, and tonight we have an interview with Barbara and Arthur Gelb, who are the authors of a 3-volume biography of O'Neill, and we taped this interview with them last year, and we are going to show it to you right now. We are delighted tonight to be joined by Barbara Gelb and Arthur Gelb. Welcome.
Thank you.
40 years studying Eugene O'Neill. What was the genesis of that obsession? If it can be called obsession. People do become obsessed with O'Neill, don't they?
We
are obsessed.
You can call it an obsession, yes. The genesis probably was the production of Long Day's Journey into Night in 1956. We had seen that same year the production of The Iceman Cometh with Jason Robards, which was a real watershed production, which was tremendously impressive, and we had always been O'Neill fans. And when a few months later Long Day's Journey came out, we realized how tremendously autobiographical it was, and we were extremely curious to know exactly how autobiographical it actually was, because there had never been a biography of O'Neill, which is a very interesting thing. I mean, he was a famous playwright. He had won the Nobel Prize, the only American playwright ever to win the Nobel Prize, and yet there had never been a full-length biography of him.
Why was that, do you think?
He was a very reclusive man. He did not give many interviews until very late in his life. He began giving a few. But there was really nothing known about him, probably because he had this very strange, dark family history that he did not want to talk about. And for the first time, it was exposed to some degree in Long Day's Journey.
Which you remember was he didn't want released for 25 years.
That's right.
Oh, that's true, until after his death.
But actually, his widow...
Way beyond his death.
His widow totally violated his wishes, and...
Thank goodness, yes.
Well, yes, thank goodness, because he had been kind of in limbo, and his reputation was nil at that point. And the fact that she violated his wishes and produced this play really did bring back his reputation.
What really stirred us more than anything was the opening, not only, well, the revival of Iceman with Jason.
10 years later.
Seeing him, 10 years later, seeing him for the first time on a stage, we couldn't believe an actor could be as wonderful as he was in that role.
And I get so damn lonely. And I think how peaceful it was here, sitting around with the old gang, getting drunk and forgetting love, laughing and joking and singing and telling lies.
But when we saw the same year, the first production with him starring as Jamie O'Neill on Broadway, that was the most extraordinary production I had ever seen. And at that point, I had been in the drama department of the Times. I was assistant to Brooks Atkinson, the dean of drama critics, and Barbara and I went to every opening. And in those days, there were openings every night, sometimes 2 openings on one night.
And you had theater columns in the papers every day.
Every day there was a theater
Sam
column.
Zolotel, he was
Sam Zolotel.
Yes, you remember good old Sam.
Sure.
And I don't think I had ever seen a standing ovation where an entire house gets up and stands.
Now it's kind of common, but in those days, people did not stand.
And when the curtain went down on this play, and remember, most people in the audience had not even read it. It had been published, but this was the first night of performance
of Long Day's Journey.
In America. It was done in Sweden, and the curtain went down. There was total silence for at least a minute. No one stirred in that house.
There was no applause.
There was
just
no
everyone was holding their breath.
And then the actors came back, and there was this thunderous ovation. And the audience didn't just stay in its seats. They started moving toward the stage. They wanted to have contact with these incredible actors.
So they wanted to be a part of this great occurrence.
And we were part of that remarkable evening, and we just couldn't get it out of our minds. We kept talking about it, and Brooks Atkinson was offered the job by Harper, by Cass Canfield, who was the major publisher in those days, and he asked Brooks Atkinson to write the biography. And he said he was too old.
There had never been one.
Right.
You know.
And you were his assistant.
He said he was too old, but he suggested that Barbara and I, because we had just written a book about Bellevue Hospital, which was a big success, Saturday Post serialized it as a 5-part work. And he said, why don't you don't do any more pot boilers. He said, do something really serious. And he said, why don't you and Barbara do O'Neill? And that's when we got...
How difficult was when you plunged into the research to get to his papers, to look through his papers? Was his widow Carlotta, was she cooperative in your research?
She became cooperative.
But she was a difficult woman.
Very difficult woman, but because Brooks Atkinson had been one of the few critics that O'Neill admired and with whom he had a relationship, and he continued to talk to Carlotta and write to Carlotta after his death, he persuaded her to talk to us, which was a tremendous boon, because she was very capricious about who she would see and who she wouldn't. The papers, everything was locked up at Yale University, and it was almost impossible to get to anything there.
Did he not want people to look at his papers?
Well, it wasn't so much him, it was her. She wanted, well, he wanted nobody to look at The Long Day's Journey. I mean, that was the one thing that he restricted. But they had both together been giving her papers and his papers to Yale during the last years of his life.
He was a very personal letter writer. He wrote, we have copies now of 3,000 letters that he had written during his lifetime. And a lot of those letters are terribly personal, involving his children and his wives and fights with his wives. And he didn't some of those letters he himself didn't want to be made public. Yeah.
There were people alive who had known not only O'Neill intimately, but his parents, and which would not have been the case 10 years later if we had started then.
What she would do when we went to interview her, first she would see Barbara separately, and then she would see me separately. And after a while, she felt Barbara was probing too deeply. And I said, I don't want to talk to you anymore.
She was very frivolous about her likes and dislikes. I mean, she would cut people off, cut people dead after for very little reason.
Really?
When the book came out, she said, she told a friend, everything that's good in that book was written by Mr. Gelb, and everything bad was written by his wife.
Well, bad being the part about O'Neill and his first wife, second wife.
We should say that the 3-volume set is a rewritten and expanded edition of your classic work, O'Neill, from 1962 was the...
It was published in 62.
Right.
It's a completely rewritten.
This is totally rewritten and totally expanded, because now we have access to all these papers that we didn't have access to.
We have access not only to all of his letters, but to the scenarios of his plays, the first drafts of his plays. And it's fascinating to look at those plays in their early versions, and to see how he changed and how a genius's mind works, and how he changed the plays. For example, in The Iceman Cometh, Hickey does not appear in the early draft. He's an afterthought. Chuck Morello, the bartender of the saloon, is the one who tells...
he goads the other people to take their walks.
He tells Harry Hope, you should get out of here, and he's the one who is the goader, right? And later, and Hickey, of course, is the only character that's not based on a real character. So O'Neill, with his imagination, working.
And how many drafts into it does Hickey finally appear?
Well, I don't know exactly how many. I mean, he was constantly revising and making notes. And,
so he takes real characters, and then then he starts changing them. And that's...
And then he writes to various different people, such as George G. Nathan, who was also a good friend of his.
Great critic for the Mercury, I think.
Right.
He gives him one explanation of who these people were, then he will give someone else, like Kenneth McGowan, who he had worked with at the Provincetown Playhouse, a different explanation completely.
Yeah.
I mean, and both are probably true at the time that he gives them, but, you know, it's...
I want to talk about the way his writing changed and why it changed. The early works, Wilderness, it's a family comedy. What happened
his only comedy up until that time.
Right.
And not that early. That's a fairly late
that's
play.
later
There are
on.
many plays before Our Wilderness, yeah.
But there is, it seems to me, the later plays, the great plays, Long Day's Journey, Iceman, they are so much more penetrating, so much more honest and brutal in looking at life than the large body of work before they came along. What happened?
You mean
in
like
his
Morning
life?
Becomes Electra
Yes,
and Strange Interlude?
Right, yes,
Christie, which were all very popular plays.
Very popular plays, terrific plays, but not, I don't think, on the level of
No, you're right.
Long
You're
Day's Journey,
absolutely
Iceman Cometh. What happened?
Well,
What was going
it's
on?
the maturity of a writer, and you must remember, when he's writing those plays, he is totally sober, unlike many other American writers who continue drinking, and you can see their deterioration as they continue their work.
His career was the exact reverse. He
O'Neill
was
stopped.
drinking.
He's one of the few playwrights, one of the few writers, American writers, one of the few great American writers who stopped drinking cold, and you could see his greatness emerging in sobriety.
When he began writing Iceman and Long Day's Journey, which he made notes for the same day, exactly, in
amazing, yeah.
1931, he was ill. He had been writing this enormous 11-play cycle about American history, and he'd been working on that for years, and he thought that it would take years more to finish it. And he suddenly began, his health began to deteriorate seriously. And he got frightened, and he was worried that he could not write the plays that he felt he must write, which were these very personal plays, Long Day's Journey and A Moon for the Misbegotten and Iceman.
Yeah, he started getting ill in 1937.
It was one of the reasons for the depth and the brutal honesty of these plays is that he knew that this was going to be his last statement, I think. And,
Do you think he put off writing about these subjects for a long time, avoided it, found ways...
Actually, he was writing Long Day's Journey into Night from the time he first started writing.
Oh, right.
He was always writing about his family, about himself as the artist who was misunderstood. In, you know, disguised versions. He never did it as openly. He did one play, a very early play, called All God's Children Got Wings, in which he actually called the woman and man, husband and wife, by Jim and Ella, which were his parents' real names. But the only reason he did that was because he thought no one would ever suspect it was his parents, because Jim was black and Ella was white, and it looked like a story of miscegenation, actually, on, you know, on the surface. It was, but he was using this to show the conflict between the two.
He constantly disguised his parents.
But it was the same kind of conflict. I mean, Ella was nuts, and Jim was this hard-working man who just never could please her and never could, you know, get what he really needed and wanted.
What's interesting about him to me in his career is that there's so many examples of American playwrights who write their greatest plays when they're young.
Yeah.
You know, Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller, often very autobiographical plays, and the later works are really not as good as that early burst of creativity. Great plays come late in the life.
O'Neill went the other way. I mean,
Yeah.
he stopped drinking and then began writing, as you
But
say.
you must
his
remember,
really
as you
great
said a little while ago, that these plays were brewing in his mind. They just didn't come out of nowhere at that particular point in his maturity.
And he had been experimenting
He had been
with
taking notes.
those characters.
He from 1929 on, he was taking notes about his parents, and the effect they were having on him. His mother's addiction, his father's
selling out, in a sense,
because he gave up his career as a Shakespearean actor in order to take the money way out.
To be Monte Cristo.
To be Monte Cristo. Right.
And our book, what our first volume tries to do, is to show the struggle between father and son, both in the home, which is hidden. No one knows what's going on in that home. It's all behind locked doors, and there is this constant battle between father and son,
And the withdrawal of the mother.
And the withdrawal of the mother.
Resentment of this withdrawal by O'Neill.
And then outside the home, there is the fight, the battle between father and son and father, over the father's old, melodramatic, silly theater, which Monte Cristo stands for, and O'Neill's determination to throw over that theater and create the modern American theater based on the influences of Ibsen and Strindberg, and of course Shakespeare.
When did O'Neill, you know, in your research, discover Ibsen and Strindberg? Are there any notes and diaries where he reads them and says, this is something that is going to have a profound influence on my life? What do you see there?
He makes notes, he writes letters, he tells people later in interviews that it was discovering Strindberg that made him realize what the potential of theater could be in America.
There's a wonderful book by Bernard Shaw called The Quintessence of Ibsenism, which he discovers when he's still in the senior year in high school. In boarding school.
But O'Neill was an avid, voracious reader from the time of 7. He was reading Anatole France when he was 7 years old. He read and read. He did nothing but read.
He read constantly.
All his life.
It was an escape at first, but then he plunged himself into
He read history, he read philosophy, he read psychology, he read
every moment
mysticism. I mean, he was, you know, he soaked everything up.
We know, of course, a lot about the family situation, the mother and the father, from Long Day's Journey into Night. Were the people that you interviewed who knew the family aware of all of these tensions going on in that family?
Very few. Most people were really shocked and horrified when the play was produced or published. And they felt that O'Neill was terrible to have done this about his family. And
many of them attacked him to us for having written so harshly about his parents.
As he said in letters to close friends, and I think maybe even an interview or two, this was, no, not an interview because he was dead before Long Day's Journey came out, but in letters, that like in many Irish families, everything is kept hidden. Inside the home, and on the outside you present this smiling, serene surface. Especially James, who was, you know, the great bon vivant, drinker in bars.
The great charmer.
He charmed everyone.
And you never would believe, seeing him and being with him in the bar rooms, that he had any troubles at all. That is, that he was totally free.
There were a few people who had little hints of this that we interviewed there. I mean, they had their meals often at houses where the mother would cook and take in a few people as
at the boarding house
as boarders. And he was fairly close to some of the people, some of the daughters of these mothers who were feeding them, and he confided a little tiny bit to some of them who we interviewed, and who said, you know, that he would say, my mother isn't well, and nothing
Not
like
saying she's a dope fiend, she's just,
not really.
But you know, it's interesting that O'Neill exaggerated the picture of his mother. Not knowing, it's true that she had all these problems and she was under the influence of morphine, but in her early days, in the early days of her marriage, she was not as miserable as O'Neill depicted her to be.
Now, this is something we've just discovered for this new volume, too. We did not have access to these files, and we discovered that she had a close friend in James O'Neill's company, a young actress who happened to be very extraordinarily bright and articulate, and who kept a diary, and who wrote letters to her mother and her grandmother, her father and her grandmother. And we have all that information now, and she describes Ella as a completely different sort of person than O'Neill depicts her in Long Day's Journey. But of course, he didn't know her before.
Right. And he was a dramatist. He was creating their character.
And, you know, he knew what she told him, what she conveyed to him from the time he was growing up. And there is this other side to her.
And you can't view Long Day's Journey greatness because it is autobiographical. I mean, if you didn't know it was autobiographical,
it would
be a great play.
Universal play about a family.
And it tells you about, you know, you learn from that play
about yourself.
And if you didn't know it was autobiographical, if you never knew anything about his parents, it would still be a great play. It's so honest. That's what makes it so great. And psychiatrists love to analyze it because many have told us that analyzing that play is like having O'Neill on the couch, because it is so true psychiatrically and psychologically.
About sons and fathers.
Yes,
and,
that's right.
Now, I must ask you, you of course had an illustrious career at the New York Times and are now head of the New York Times Foundation, but you were the drama reporter.
Well, I started out as the way most reporters started out in those days, in the mid-40s. I was a police reporter, general assignment. I covered the City Hall, and then I was about to go overseas, and Brooks Atkinson, who was then the great drama critic of the Times, called me, and I was at the United Nations, and getting my experience, and he asked me to if I'd like to join the drama department, because I had been writing pieces for the Sunday drama section on a freelance basis, and he said, you could always go overseas. Why don't you try this, and I think you'll like it, and maybe you could be a critic someday.
Did you ever interview O'Neill? Did you ever meet him?
No, but Barbara did.
I met him very briefly. My stepfather was a playwright, S.N. Berman,
Sure, yes.
and he had a play on Broadway at the same time that O'Neill had Iceman Cometh rehearsing. He had met O'Neill in California. I don't remember exactly the circumstances, but they were both produced by the Theater Guild, and I suppose someone in the Guild put them together. And my stepfather told me he had an absolutely enchanting visit with him in California. O'Neill showed him his Nobel Prize. He took it out, actually showed him the physical prize. And they became, you know, sort of semi-friends. And when O'Neill came to New York a few years later to rehearse Iceman, my stepfather invited him to come to a rehearsal of his play. And knowing that I was fascinated with O'Neill, he said I could come to that rehearsal. So I just very, very briefly was introduced to him and shook hands with him. He was very frail, and he didn't even get up. He couldn't get up. He was, you know, really not physically robust.
Playwrights, not only Sam Berman, but all playwrights admired O'Neill. He stood for the
best that American drama.
He stood for the revolution of the American theater. He made it grow up.
In fact, Sam Berman, when we started working on the book, and we got more and more into debt because we wanted to do so much research, he staked us to finish the book, because he said this book has to be finished.
Yeah.
Yes, Harper gave us a tiny advance and paid none of our expenses.
In those days, advances were not very large.
Well, still for theater books, I'm afraid they're not very large either. We have to wrap it up, but very quickly, is there an O'Neill play that you think is underappreciated that we should go back to and is deserving of the kind of full-scale revival that The Iceman Cometh had with Kevin Spacey last season, and that A Moon for the Misbegotten is going to get soon, I think, with Cherry Jones?
That may be the one play that, but it did have a wonderful, brilliant production.
Sure, with Colleen Dewhurst.
But after the great production of Anna Christie, which I always thought, I think you would agree,
yes, you
Barbara,
never can tell. I mean,
was
that
kind
seems
of
like a very silly
play, and we saw that at a preview, and we were gassed. I mean, it was just.
But it depends on it happened to be that Neeson and Richardson were in love at that moment.
Right, Natasha Richardson and Liam Neeson
the heat on the stage was palpable.
If you had a Neeson and Richardson in Desire Under the Elms, let's say,
right, yeah,
I think you'd have the same kind of
that could be probably revived.
Of reaction. That's a play that's underrated, I believe. Desire Under the Elms. I think there's a possibility that someone will do a great production of it.
Are you listening, Lincoln Center or Roundabout Theater Company?
Oh, we talked to them about it.
The book is Eugene O'Neill, Life with Monte Cristo, published by Putnam and Applause Books. The authors are Barbara and Arthur Gelb, the O'Neill experts. Thanks a lot for being our guest tonight on Theater Talk.
Thank you.
So we close now with the Goodman Theater production of A Moon for the Misbegotten, which is moving to Broadway in March. We'll see you next time on Theater Talk. Good night.
The world must be full of lights. So you didn't have a drink at the inn, eh? Well, then it must be the air itself smells of whiskey today, though I wasn't